Hi, Glenn A. Baker here. Iva Davies once had no particular interest or enthusiasm for rock and pop music. An experienced oboe player with an extensive background in classical and chamber music and an assured future in the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, Iva viewed posturing rock stars with undisguised contempt. In 1984, he said, "I was with a girl who was an absolute fanatic about all these people I had absolutely no time at all for, like Lou Reed and Mark Bolan, people who sang really out of tune and all that business. I actually subjected myself to this stuff in the process of trying to work out what was so appealing about it. And that's how I became fanatical about certain artists. So initially, I hated rock and roll. The fascination was that it had so many things wrong with it that I couldn't work out why it even existed. It was a perverse fascination. Now, there was a certain naivety about it all that was really endearing, and in the end, I became a fan of all these people, and their hits became my favourite songs." In a short time, Iva changed from a cynical outsider to a rock star, a major force in Oz rock and one of its formidable international ambassadors. After receiving an electric guitar for his 21st birthday, he left the ABC Training Orchestra and began recording for RCA as Iva Davies and Afghan, Ivor being his real name. By 1977, he had formed the first version of the band Flowers, named after the Lindsay Kemp mime and music show. Playing mostly cover versions of 60s and 70s glam rock songs, the outfit built up an exceptionally strong following and came to the attention of Regular Records, home of Mental as Anything. Iva's friendship with the label's co-owner, Cameron Allen, went back to the days when they had studied music together at the Sydney Conservatorium. Under Allen's production, Iva jettisoned Eno, Sex Pistols and T-Rex songs and came up with a stack of original compositions for the first album, Icehouse. All concerned with the project were more than a little stunned when the LP stormed into the national top 5, while the first single, Iva's Can't Help Myself, made the top 10. A second hit, We Can Get Together, late in 1980, made top 20, as did Walls and then Love in Motion, which they recorded in London. By the end of 1981, the album had sold over 200,000 copies, then 5 times platinum. For 1982's Primitive Man album, which made top 5 in Germany, the group's name had to be changed from Flowers to Icehouse due to the existence of a British band called Flowers. They were signed to the Chrysalis label in the UK and great things were expected of them. The first really great thing was a rather remarkable creation called Great Southern Land, which made top 5 in August 1982 and was Iva's biggest hit since Can't Help Myself. But I'll have more to say about that a little later. The crisply appealing Hey Little Girl from Primitive Man was a global hit early in 1983. Top 10 in Australia and parts of Europe, top 20 in the UK and top 40 in the US. Iva would detail, "Hey Little Girl was just a title on a piece of paper for a month. I liked the sound of it. I thought it was real rock and roll. I kept thinking, how do I use this title? And in the end, the song was written around the title and recorded with producer Keith Forsey and no engineer in Giorgio Moroder's home demo studio. We thought it was a bit rough, but it became our biggest hit." Iva took the band name change in his stride as he did all other aspects of his career. He was very much an ungracious pop star, never comfortable with his fame placing him under a microscope. He said at the time, "I've always seen what I do as a hobby that I could do without if I wanted to. I never get desperate and feel that I have to do an album or a European tour. I really admire bands like INXS who effected a copybook takeover of America by the hardest method there is, wearing away at the stone, haranguing the market by constant touring. I have a kind of unspoken agreement with America. I don't understand it and it doesn't understand me. I get very frustrated by America's musical attitude. Everything there is safe. A lot of the appeal of Ice House to Americans was that we were very different to what the people were used to. Now, Ice House toured America in 1980 and did not return until 1986. By this stage, they had the Sidewalk and Measure for Measure albums under their belt. No Promises was a hit in a number of markets around the globe, and the fan legion was swelling. Among Iva's admirers in the top half of the world was David Bowie, who invited him out as support on a 12-date European tour. There was a second, albeit minor, UK hit with Street Cafe, and then a 2-year hiatus of sorts, during which Iva scored the Russell Mulcahy film Razorback and composed with fellow Ice House member Bob Kretschmer, and recorded the score for a ballet called Boxes, which was staged at the Sydney Opera House. It could be said that music just flowed from the pores of the young Davies. Iva had begun playing musical instruments at the age of 6 and had learned to play the oboe at 11. He was and is both a trained and a natural musician, and as was plainly evident, a highly competent and gifted songwriter. About that skill he once observed, "I try not to use too many chords or become too complex. I strive for that universality of sentiment which is so important in songwriting. If you get too specific about an event in a song, many people can't connect. Listeners should be able to superimpose a meaning of their own over what you're saying to them. I hate overt politics in songs. The politics of existence, truisms, are more important." Now, this has held fast through a season of reunion performances which has seen the band draw as many punters as they did at their peak. Ice House came surging back to prominence in 1987 with the Man of Colours album, which in this country just sold and sold and sold, eventually becoming the biggest selling album in Australia ever by an Australian band. Sales exceeded 750,000 copies, taking him towards the levels achieved by solo stars John Farnham and Jimmy Barnes. It won so many platinum awards that the yardstick became almost meaningless. Crazy was number 4. Electric Blue, which he had written with John Oates of Hall & Oates, was number 1. Both of them were top 10 in the US. Following it was always going to be a massive task, and although 1990's Code Blue went straight into the top 10, it achieved just 1 platinum plaque. Now, it wasn't until New Year's Eve 1999 that Iva Davies could escape the niggling concern that he was going to be remembered for the wrong song. For a very, very long time, he admitted, my whole life was defined by the only number 1 hit I'd ever had, and that was Electric Blue. In fact, I went for a lot of years thinking, this is the one with which your name is synonymous. Well, in the 40 minutes preceding the switch to a new decade and millennium, the vocalist and guitarist stood on the northern forecourt of the Sydney Opera House, watched by a global television audience, and deftly conducted a rich ensemble that included the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, virtuoso violinist Richard Tognetti, Pink Floyd bass player Guy Pratt, and a group of taiko drummers. That night it went under the name The Ghost of Time, but for anyone alive and aware in Australia since 1982, it was unmistakably Great Southern Land. He's not fielded many questions about Electric Blue since then. In 2006, I prepared a feature for the now defunct Bulletin magazine, marking the 25th anniversary of Great Southern Land and what it has come to mean to Australians. There was a reawakening of interest in it, which hadn't been there for at least 10 or so years, he said then, still with an element of surprise. I never really got it. I remember the reaction around me to the song when I produced it as a demo and played it first for the record company and management, and I could tell straight away there was something going on. They immediately jumped on it, and I could never understand quite why. To this day, I still don't. It's the way of a songwriter, I think. There have been a lot of instances where I've said, this is a good example of the craft. Something has happened correctly here, and I think this is going to work, and I have been right. But there's been a number of outstanding examples, and Great Southern Land is one of them, where I wouldn't have picked it in a million years. With greater gravitas than a snappy pop chart hit or even an expansive album track, it had from the outset the capacity to reach, touch and intrigue, though some first reactions seemed to reinforce his own uncertainties. One leading rock press review was withering, and radio seemed initially daunted. I could sense the blades being sharpened all over the place, Iva admits. It was 5 minutes long and you couldn't really dance to it. There were very high expectations and a deal of scepticism because the original band had been disassembled and I'd virtually done the album on my own. Let me just establish a time frame here. Australian rock, for all the sterling 70s efforts of Skyhook's Greg McCainch and his songs about Baldwin and Carlton, and Australian Crawl's bronze Bayside offerings, was still not entirely comfortable in its own skin. We'd just heard Cold Chisel's Bow River, but Goanna's pivotal solid rock was still a few months away, and Midnight Oil were despairing over US forces, with Dead Heart, Beds Are Burning and Blue Sky Mining not arriving until later in the decade. INXS had a policy of never allowing overt marketing of them in the US as an Australian band. Iva revealed to me when I wrote that story, when I did write Great Southern Land, I was taken aside by my management and told very soberly that under no circumstances whatsoever must I admit in the press that this song was about Australia. I was told, you can say anything you like, but don't be that specific about it. I can remember being asked directly by so many interviewers, and again I deflected that question and said, well, it could be about anywhere. It could be about the Antarctic. Perhaps it's just a great body that's down there somewhere. But never once did I actually say, well, yes, it's about Australia, because I was instructed very severely not to do so. I understand now the thinking behind it, which was you've just got your first international contract, we're putting this out worldwide, and we don't want to appear parochial and southern hemispheric. I managed to sustain it for a short amount of time, but of course it was nonsense, and I found it very difficult to do because I cannot easily tell a lie. After a while, it was just silly and it unravelled very quickly. Supremely silly, because there was nothing even vaguely accidental about what came tumbling out of Iva's head after his first overseas trip and flight home over the vast expanse of Terra Australis with a brace of new sound technology stored in the hold. The overarching thought I had was, as he said, well, this land is the sovereign entity. We're all tenants. It's been here forever and it will be here long after we're gone. And if I take that perspective on it, then it becomes the entity and we become purely occupants, and everything that we do becomes trivial by comparison. So it was really the kind of continuum of the land, regardless of occupation, that really interested me. When I came to sit down with the lyrics, I knew that there was really just no way in the world I could cover everything within the space of a song. So the best thing that I could do was to fracture it, to be selective about the 3-word phrases that I used, so that it would never really make any sense, but would certainly set off a lot of thoughts. And the only other very calculated thought, and it mystifies me that I was thinking with that amount of depth in my early 20s, was that I wanted to make sure that it had 2 evenly balanced scales, that there was an ancient and a modern, a black and a white, that there was no weighting in one direction. A lot of these things are quite instinctive, but I remember catching myself concocting the phrase. First of all, I must have decided somewhere that I wanted to write about Australia, and the first thing I would have said to myself, and I know this for sure, was nothing is going to rhyme with Australia. The second thing was, how can I invent a phrase that means Australia, that nobody's ever heard before? And to this day, I believe, perhaps incorrectly, that I invented the phrase Great Southern Land. Heard then, heard now, the song evokes images of a grand vista, of a writer standing atop a high escarpment in the Red Heart, gazing out across the baked earth into the open-ended possibility that is Australia. If lives did in fact come easy, Davies might have let that perception take root, but the reality is that it all came together in the near industrial urban landscape of a small front room in a Leichhardt house with bars on the window and a tumble of audio equipment on brick-supported planks. Buses stopped in front of the house every 10 minutes and the place shook, Davies detailed. In between them, there were planes going directly overhead, very low. So I had a cocktail of noise going on the whole time. And thinking back to how I actually worked, I must have spent my entire days with headphones on. I'm sure I wouldn't have managed any other way. The tough birth of Davies' determined epic seemed to have equipped it well for a sturdy life. Starting out as a pub rock staple, one that admittedly made punters lower their glasses for the duration, over the next quarter century it has been rendered orchestrally, chorally, solo acoustically and half acoustically, half electric, though not always with initial ease, because of the construction of a backdrop of instruments that produced it in the first place, as he says. It's almost as if some determination to be heard within the song itself sweeps aside barriers. Like with many of my songs, says Iva, I created the landscape before I put the figures in it. And when you decide that you're going to take away the landscape, it becomes quite a difficult exercise. So I guess it surprises me that it does manage to fight its way through those difficult reinventions. So the man who gave us Great Southern Land and a dozen albums full of commanding songs this year joins the ranks of so very many phenomenally accomplished Australian creators whom I have been privileged to have inducted into the ranks of Songwriter of the Year. Would you please avert your gaze to the screens before you then welcome to the podium with cascades of warmth, affection and pride, our very own Iva Davies.